Welcome, everybody. This is our second shindig that we're doing with the leading voices in higher education. My name is Greg Schuckman. I work for the University of Central Florida here in Washington, D.C., and I'm also a doctoral student at the University of Florida in the Lead Higher Education Administration program. This is a series that has primarily been designed for the students and faculty in the higher education administration programs at UF and UCF, although we will find people coming in from time to time from other organizations that have heard about this, are intrigued by the idea, and certainly by today's speaker, who I'm absolutely delighted to introduce and that he's joined us today. So before I do that, let me explain to you, for those of you who are new to Shindig, what this is and what you can do and why we're very excited to partner with Shindig to do this series. So as you're learning, Shindig is a video conferencing interactive experience on steroids. There can actually have up to 1,000 people participating at any one time. And if you look at the bottom on the toolbar, it'll show you a number of icons, one of which is a text chat. You can direct that to Tara, who is Tara Peitzers with Shindig and the person operating everything behind the scenes. So if you need help getting your camera on or your audio, or you want to ask a question, send a text to Tara. You can raise your hand to ask a question, and that question can, if you would like, be brought up on stage where Scott and I are in the windows, and you can ask the question live. We are recording this session. It is off the record, and that is meant so that people feel less inhibited about asking their questions. There is nobody that I know of in Washington who is more attuned to what is happening in higher education than Scott Jaschik. And I realize this is so because Scott has lived his entire life in higher education. He is a Cornell grad who went to work for the Chronicle in 1985 and went from there after being editor for a number of years and co-founded and is the editor of Inside Higher Ed. And for those of you who are not subscribers to Inside Higher Ed, shame on you. It is a must read. And you don't wake up early enough to beat Inside Higher Ed, because I get it usually between 4:30 in the morning every day in my inbox, and it is just full of great insights, great commentary, sometimes great book reviews, and as I learned this morning, good counsel about not hugging people when they don't want to be hugged. And I'll let Scott talk to that in a bit. But Scott is, as I said, editor of Inside Higher Ed. He serves on the board of the Education Writers Association, which is another great organization that I would encourage you to subscribe to their newsletters for. And the Shindig series, again, thank you so much to Shindig for allowing us to even do this. We had Scott Jenkins from Lumina Foundation 2 weeks ago. We will have Brian Sponsler from the Education Commission of the States 2 weeks from today. And this is the 50th anniversary, Scott, so you know, for both the University of Florida's Institute of Higher Education and the University of Central Florida College of Education and Human Development. So this is a golden anniversary celebration. Scott, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all of you. I'm going to run through what I see as some of the top issues in higher education today, starting with federal and then talking about some non-federal issues. And you are welcome to interrupt with questions at any time. I want to say I really enjoy working with programs like these that help future leaders in higher education, because you all will be the provosts and presidents of institutions down the road, and higher ed needs, no offense to higher ed's current talent, but it needs new talent. So I'm happy to meet with and talk to groups like your own. So I'm going to just dive in and ask questions at any time. Greg, are there instructions they need on asking questions, or they know what to do?
Again, if you have a question, just click the raise your hand icon, and we can take it from there in terms of
Okay,
you either asking a question by text or coming up on stage. And Scott, I may have some questions for you during your time
sure.
as well.
So I'm going to start on big shifts, big changes. Number one, I think, and this has real ramifications for all of higher education, is an end to the push from the Obama administration and previous administrations to tell Americans they need college education. I think this is less gets less attention than it should, but I think it is a tremendously important shift. Under President Obama, you saw the president and Michelle Obama use their bully pulpit constantly to say you should go to college. And now they were sometimes mocked as if by Republicans, as if they were saying everyone should go to a 4-year college and read great books. That's actually not what they said. They said everyone needs some post-secondary training, and they had a big impact. There have been fascinating studies that when Michelle Obama visited a community, the number of FAFSA applications skyrocketed. Their use of the bully pulpit, and they were very creative about this. They used humor, they created videos, had a really big impact. I don't think it is a coincidence that under the Obama administration, you saw high school graduation rates go up, and you saw them go up for all groups, not just wealthier students, not just white and Asian students. I think that potentially could have really changed the direction of the country. Now, the message we're getting from our leaders is maybe we don't need higher education so much. Maybe we can improve the economy just by, say, having a trade war, imposing tariffs. We're going to bring back coal. We're going to bring back factories. That message to you all, as educators, you probably might just chuckle at it. But the reality is, to a lot of people who are underemployed or unemployed, it's a big deal to go to college and get training at a community college or somewhere else. And now they're hearing that's not the solution. I think that's a big, big change. And that leads me to number two, which is in the last month, we have seen the administration attack community colleges in a way that I find quite unusual. There was a brief mention of the State of the Union, and then that was followed up with remarks by the president the next day in which he said, among other things, that all community colleges should change their names to vocational schools and they should focus only on vocational programs.
Right.
Now, the irony is here I am speaking to a group of Floridians where community colleges are changing their names to drop community because they're all adding 4-year degrees. But most important, Florida, I would say perhaps more than any other state, has come to rely on community colleges to produce bachelor's students. And I don't mean those who are in the bachelor's programs, because that's actually a small share of community college enrollment. I mean the people who are starting their bachelor's education at a community college and then transferring to a place like UCF. Florida, the University of Florida, I don't think gets as large a percentage, but most of the universities in Florida, significant numbers transfer in from community colleges. And even more important, the percent, if you look at a place like UCF and look at their percentage of graduates who come from community college, but then look at the percentage of minority graduates who come from community college, it's a much higher percentage. The reality is, Florida is using community colleges to diversify those who are educated, to provide a bachelor's degree education. Now, in part, this is because Florida has so much population growth that they wouldn't have space if all those people started at the universities and didn't start at community colleges. But it also is, in fact, a very cost effective way for students and the state. And the idea that community colleges are being forced to explain, oh, we have this transfer function, is, I think, really quite remarkable. Now, you may find yourself thinking, well, who cares what the president thinks? The president can't actually tell a Valencia college or a Miami-Dade college what it should do, and you're correct in that. But state legislators pay a lot of attention. A state legislator who maybe doesn't want to provide money to Florida community colleges, well, has just been given an excuse by the President of the United States. And likewise, most surveys show the public thinks highly of community colleges and views community colleges as a sector that is focused on helping people improve their lives and their well-being. For President Trump to say nobody understands them and that they're not doing enough on voc ed is kind of strange, and in my opinion at least does not reflect the facts of what community colleges do. I think it is very dangerous for any sector of higher ed when the President of the United States sort of trashes that sector, as we've seen here. Issue 3, for-profits. So if the president isn't so high on community colleges, is very high, or his administration is very high for profit higher education. Again, the comparison to the Obama administration is very striking. And I don't think President Obama in office with goals
Okay, so I think Scott got bumped out and is going to relog in, and he's back.
Okay, I think I'm back. So I don't think I did something to be bounced down, but I'll try not to do whatever I did. But in President Obama's
started talking about
first year,
for-profits, and then the whole thing got very fuzzy.
But in President Obama's first budget, he got a lot more money for Pell Grants. And the administration was somewhat upset when they realized the biggest winners were for-profits that got a lot more of that Pell Grant money. And then, as the administration progressed, you had some big for-profit failures, which left the administration with no good options about what to do. So President Obama pushed gainful employment, which got pushed back and so forth, but he put a lot of attention on the for-profit issues and didn't get very far. He lost some court battles. A lot of Republicans in Congress rallied behind the for-profits. Didn't go very well. Now, under Secretary DeVos, rules that the for-profits didn't like are being rolled back, and there's a lot of encouragement offered to the for-profits. Now, right now, the for-profits are not at their strongest point economically, but I think they will bounce back because of this. Issue 4, international students. I think this is another very significant and historic shift. In the current year, we are seeing a 7% decline in new international students. That is huge for American higher education. In part, it is huge because many of you, no doubt, care about educating the best and brightest from around the world. That's a wonderful mission. But the reality is many American colleges and universities need the tuition revenue from students from around the world. And what we're seeing is the hostility of the Trump administration to certain countries has scared off many students. While the travel ban is symbolically very important, the reality is the countries that are covered by the various versions of the travel ban aren't the biggest countries in terms of supplying international students. But that sent a message, and a 7% decline in new students, that impact is going to keep growing year after year. Then we've seen in the last 2 weeks, the head of the FBI basically accused Chinese students of being spies. This did not go over very well in China, and a lot of institutions that depend on Chinese students are very nervous about that and the reaction to it. And then today, with the new tariffs imposed by the president, there is growing concern of a trade war. If China wanted to retaliate against the United States, if it cut the number of exit visas by even like 2-3%, it could do great damage to American higher education. Now, if you look at the numbers so far, the colleges that are most elite are doing fine because international students, even if they hate Donald Trump, they will keep coming to the United States to get into our top research universities. But not so much for the others. Canada is going after our students. New Zealand is going after our students. Australia is going after our students, or the students we would like to come. So this is going to be increasingly a big issue as U.S. colleges and universities try to hold on to their foreign student populations. Issue 5, race relations are really lousy in American higher education. Now, I don't want to say this is all Donald Trump's fault. Race relations haven't been good at many American colleges for a long time. But I think that the election of Trump has sort of loosened people's inhibitions, and they are saying things in public that they wouldn't have said in public before. They are saying things that are hurtful and hateful to many of their fellow students. We see more incidents, not just against black people, but anti-Semitic incidents are way up on campus in the last year, up 89%. For American higher education, it is a challenge because American higher education, one, the leaders of American higher education care very much about diversity, and two, American higher education cannot function just based on wealthy, well-educated white students coming out of good high schools. That is not who makes up the future of American higher education. Generally, right now, American higher education fares better when we are more united as a nation than when we are divided as a nation. And so I think this is really going to hurt. Now, I've been giving you all a bunch of negative stuff, so I'm going to throw in a positive trend of late, and that is the budget deal that happened after the briefest of government shutdowns. Now, this is good for higher ed, particularly research universities like the ones that run your graduate programs for several reasons. One is any sustained budget shutdown is really bad. But the really important thing about the budget deal is that it lifted many of the spending caps that have effectively made it very difficult to get major increases into the NSF, the NIH, the Energy Department research programs, and so forth. Support for these programs in Congress is actually strong and bipartisan. President Trump proposed a bunch of cuts in his first budget. They were largely rejected. And many in higher ed feels that there is a need for big increases in these agencies. Now, lifting the caps doesn't mean Congress will follow through and do it. That remains to be seen. But it makes it possible for that to happen. Whereas under the caps, it sort of didn't matter. There wasn't as much that could be done given the number of programs that have entitlements or other limits on cutting them. So that part of the budget bill, I think, bodes well for those who depend on research grants in the years ahead and could be very significant. So there's actual good news. Now I'm going to talk about reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act, which many wouldn't say there's such good news. So first of all, we have sort of a split here between Virginia Foxx in the House, Lamar Alexander in the Senate, and the Trump administration. Foxx is ahead of the others. My sense is that while the Trump administration is talking about this, I don't think the leadership is going to come from the administration. I think it's coming from Congress. And most of the people I know in higher ed are very much hoping that Lamar Alexander takes the lead. Not that Lamar Alexander agrees with everything that higher ed leaders say, but he has much more of a reputation for at least hearing out the people in higher education and for taking an approach of how can we solve this problem together. He's a moderate Republican, if we have moderate Republicans anymore. He was education secretary before. He was a university president before. He has some appreciation for higher ed. Now, Virginia Foxx was also a college president, but it does not seem to have left her with any identification or affection for the people who work in colleges and universities. So she has taken much more of a aggressive approach to the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act. The House is also further ahead than the Senate. So one thing I have to say before you get too nervous is I still don't know that anything's going to happen in this Congress. Lamar Alexander says he wants to have something happen, but I think we are looking at a very short window of sort of between now and the summer for things to really start to move. Congress is severely dysfunctional and seems to have a hard time on agreeing on most things. If we get into the summer months and the Democrats appear to think that they have a good chance of regaining one or both houses of Congress, they're going to have very little incentive to do anything. And if the Republicans are focused on primary challenges and whatever else is going on, they may not buckle down and do this. Now, I still think there is some hope for it. If you look at Patty Murray, the ranking Democrat on Lamar Alexander's committee, Alexander and Murray, while they, again, don't agree on everything, have shown an ability to get along and to compromise together that you don't see in Congress as a whole. So if they took the lead, I could see real movement happening. But, they tried to do something on healthcare that got nowhere. So I don't know what will happen. A few things, though, about the Virginia Fox version of what has been called the Prosper Act. One is, again, removing most regulation of for-profits. Virginia Fox likes the for-profits much more than public or nonprofit private higher education. The bill would also impose performance-based funding on some grants, particularly to minority-serving institutions. This is a big deal because many of the institutions that depend on these grants are institutions that serve very low-income students, many of them not well prepared, and they would argue that their low graduation rates are not a sign that the institutions are doing anything wrong, but are a sign of just who they serve. Our blogger, Confessions of a Community College Dean, has done several blog posts about how dangerous this could be to community colleges. Likewise, she is pushing the idea of risk sharing. Now, that's something that Lamar Alexander is also interested in. And here the idea is that those over a certain threshold by program analysis are not repaying their loans will face certain sanctions. And again, the problem that some see with this isn't that colleges shouldn't be held accountable, but will this create disincentives for colleges to enroll and work with low-income students? If you are Harvard or Stanford, you don't need to worry about any of this because you graduate 98% of your students. If you are Bunker Hill Community College, you do need to worry about it. And even if you're Valencia College or Miami-Dade College, Florida's got great community colleges, but they take students who not everyone would take. And they have amazing successes, but it's not complete. Another big provision of the Prosper Act that has many worried is limits on graduate borrowing. This affects any institutions with graduate programs. Law schools are very worried about this. Anything that forces more students into the private lending space could discourage students from attending, or big problem with private loans is I find whenever I'm talking to somebody who's actually borrowed, most people who are borrowing private loans don't seem to have a clue that they lack the protections available in the federal programs. This is really bad because, as many of you probably know, that life happens. And when life happens in ways that aren't good, the federal protections make a big deal. The other big change that I see in Congress, and this is reflected a little bit in the Higher Ed Act, but also in the recent budget deal, is sort of higher ed is off the pedestal, if it ever was really on it. And here you see the most evidence of this in the endowment tax. Now, those of you who are at public institutions may say, oh, well, I don't need to worry about this. This is just the wealthy institutions. But to me, once you have that in, it's much easier, and I've already heard some people talking about it, Let's extend it to public institutions. Let's change the ratio and bring in more money. Once it's established, that's possible. Now, the public institutions with high endowments generally are much larger than the private colleges with endowments in the 1 to 2 billion range. So they may not be affected, but there is more scrutiny coming of every college endowment, and there is a perception on the Hill that colleges are lazy, as best epitomized by lazy rivers. And I do not think that the students who are sunning themselves in the lazy rivers are typical of American higher education, but a lot of people in Congress do, and that is really bad for American higher education as a whole. Maybe particularly bad, I guess, for those from Florida, where students do have a natural need to be in the sun. So I want to talk briefly about some non-federal issues before getting to your questions. One is the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement obviously did not originate in higher education, but it is dramatically shaking up higher education. There's a lot of discussion in recent years about sex assault on campus, but the Me Too movement has many campuses really nervous because people are pointing out that far too many campuses ignored serious allegations made by women, students, grad students, faculty members against prominent men on the faculty. And there are been far too many cases that have come to light where faculty members who were successful at landing grants somehow didn't get the scrutiny they deserved. I see this issue growing, not shrinking, and a lot of colleges being forced to look at their policies and their records. Another non-federal issue, many private colleges, many more than in the past, are in trouble. When people talk about private colleges, people think of the elites. The reality is most private colleges are tuition dependent and don't have a lot of money. We are seeing more mergers, more closures. I think that's going to continue to happen. In some cases, may be good. Now, I do not go with the Clayton Christensen prediction that 500 colleges will close in the next few years, but 60 might, and that's a big deal. Many of these are small institutions that serve, again, low-income students. Another issue on the non-federal front, two more I want to mention before going to your questions. The states are all over the place in terms of support. Some are actually providing more support than in recent years. California, Jerry Brown reversed a lot of the big cuts that started after the economic downturn of 2008. But in California, and this is something, again, you Florida people will relate to, there's been so much enrollment growth that the appropriations increases are not really keeping up with the growth. And so you have a problem of public institutions being severely strapped for finance in most states, and at a time that they have more students coming in and more demands on them. And then one more issue I want to mention before going to your questions is a lack of appreciation for the liberal arts. Now, I hope we have no one here who is an anthropology major, because, as you know, your governor doesn't think the world needs anthropology majors, although I believe it came out that his daughter was an anthropology major. Now, if we do have any anthropology majors here, it will, and you are now higher ed administrators rising through the ranks, it will actually illustrate an important truth. Most people who major in anthropology or English or history do not do so to become anthropologists or history professors or poets. They do so to learn about the world that we live in, to learn critical thinking and communication skills, which they apply in any number of ways. But there is a constant meme right now from Democratic and Republican politicians alike to devalue the liberal arts and particularly the humanities. And I think this undercuts institutions. If you look at, say, UCF and UF, they are both institutions which have many professional programs like the ones you're in, and even as undergrads that many are in pre-professional programs. But they have at their core arts and sciences departments that provide people with general education and a well-rounded education. And that is a key differentiator in what people do in life. The interesting thing to me is the critics, like your governor, imply that anyone who majors in the liberal arts will end up working at Starbucks. And it is just not true. We just wrote about a fascinating study by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that looked at humanities graduates over time. Guess what? One, they're employed. Two, they're decently paid. And three, this is the really striking thing, they're happy. And yet you would think they're all miserable on the streets. But higher ed has failed, in my opinion, to answer this criticism, and as a result is constantly on the defensive for having gen ed programs. So I have covered a lot of ground quickly, sadly not giving you much good news, but I want to again invite you, as Greg said, if you send me an email to, and Greg can send around my email address after, if you're not getting Inside Higher Ed's daily news alerts, I will remedy that. It is free, and also welcome any ideas you have, and I welcome your questions.
So thanks, Scott. And that was the whirlwind that I fully expected from you. Just a reminder for everybody, if you look at the bottom where there's the hand icon, if you click that, that will allow you to raise your hand to ask a question, or you can click on the question mark icon for sending a text. But let me go ahead and start while people are teeing up their questions. Scott, you were talking about mergers and closures. And I know you've done a lot of writing about these, particularly the small religiously affiliated liberal arts institutions seem to be the ones that are most at risk. But when you look at what's happening in states like Georgia, or you look at what Wisconsin is considering merging their systems, or you look at this study New Mexico just did looking at their whole higher ed, do you think that portends potential mergers and closures on the public side?
It may. So Georgia is very different from Wisconsin. So in Georgia, the thing that is surprising is Georgia, like Florida, has population growth and has very large state universities. But that is not stopping Georgia from merging them. I'd say Georgia is the leader in the public sector in this. Now, Georgia argues that they will save money, but it's tricky because Georgia simultaneously argues that they won't decrease the number of programs. And whether they can pull this all off remains to be seen, but they are moving ahead. In New York State, SUNY tried not quite to go to merger, but to combine presidencies and some programs at some public campuses. And SUNY has campuses throughout a large state, and some of those campuses aren't so big. They faced serious backlash because, you know what, people may like to gripe about their president, but they want their own president. They are, they care about that. Georgia's playing off SUNY less so. Now, Wisconsin, what they're doing, which is a little different, is they're trying to somehow align the regional 2-year campuses with the 4-year campuses. There, to the extent there's a problem, it's in some of the rural parts of Wisconsin, and much of Wisconsin is rural. The 2-year colleges are shrinking in enrollment because the population there is shrinking. So what the state argues is that this will preserve those campuses. Too early to see. I would say that the faculty hate it. Some of the local community members hate it. Small community colleges are very important to local communities to educate, to employ, to provide, cultural and social events. They matter to these communities. Now in Florida, everything is so big that I don't know that you're going to have the same demand on merger. There in Florida, it strikes me the crisis is not enough capacity. And I look at both the 4-year and the 2-year institutions, and I think most of them could serve more students if they had more classrooms, were able to hire more faculty, and so forth. So this is on the public side too, in very different ways.
Okay. You're getting a little laggy there, Scott. Sorry.
That's okay.
Um, okay. And he's back again. Okay.
Okay, I'm back.
We'll figure this out. Um, you touched very briefly on the administration and the Department of Education, but who's actually minding the store for post-secondary education at the department?
Well, that's sort of unclear. We have some very smart. We have the guy Brogan from who was at Pennsylvania, did a lot of good things, well respected. I think the challenge right now is that a lot of the mid-level positions are unfilled, and my sense is a lot of civil servants who do very important work in the department are not feeling terribly empowered, are nervous. The department has moved most speedily in higher.
Okay,
Am
you're
I
back, Scott.
back? Okay,
Yeah.
good. They've moved most speedily on for-profit higher ed and sex assault. In both cases, trying to undo the policies of the Obama administration. I have talked to several people who were recruited to the department who are among the many very thoughtful Republicans on higher ed policy, and they don't want to be there.
Yeah.
I think one person told me he didn't want to answer his granddaughter's question, why did you join the Trump administration? And if you look at the talent pool, and there's a really good talent pool on among Republicans on higher ed, federal higher ed policy. There are people who want to focus on things like accountability and assessment. They're not necessarily people who want to focus on sex assault policy and for-profit higher ed. So I think it has been difficult for the administration to recruit there. Um, so I don't know. Again, I think the place to watch is Congress, because Virginia Fox is moving. Lamar Alexander says he wants to move. That's where I think we may have more important decision making.
Right. Okay. And my classmates and colleagues are being shy, so I'm going to start calling them if they don't ask
Oh
questions.
dear.
Um, but I've got a whole list, so we'll just
Okay, fire away.
so you were talking about if higher ed was ever on a pedestal, it's not there anymore, and we've seen some Gallup poll data that's come out even more recently, talking, and I guess they dug a little deeper and found out it's not just Republicans and Democrats, it's particularly Republican men who don't have a degree,
White
that we
men in
really don't.
particular.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit to
Sure.
the polls?
Well, I think it relates to what I was talking about earlier. The administration is telling the world the cause of your economic problems is that we regulated Detroit cars or that we regulated coal. They're not saying that the economy has changed in ways that require that we better educate people. And so people are hearing that message. Likewise, they are getting a false message that all of American higher ed is obsessed with free speech and the culture wars. Look, these are very real issues. Look at how what the University of Florida went through to host Richard Spencer, who they didn't really want there anyway, but they respected his free speech rights.
Right.
That's not really free speech is a part of American higher ed, but fighting over free speech is not necessarily what is about American higher ed. To read the conservative blogosphere, you would think all of American higher ed is just obsessed with like burning the American flag or whatever. That's not what American higher ed is about. But you have that steady drumbeat. You don't have people talking about how higher ed can help people. And we have this. Now, what's interesting is among African Americans and Latinos who have their own sets of issues, many of them think higher ed isn't as supportive as it should be of minority and first generation students. but they see higher ed still as mattering. And forget the polls for a second. Every study of actual results shows that degrees advance people economically. There is no debate about this. And
Right.
yet, to listen to pundits and some politicians, you would think it's an open question of whether earning an associate degree or a bachelor degree helps you economically. It is not an open question, it's a resolved question. And yet, people keep pretending otherwise.
So, if I'm hearing you, you're sort of suggesting that higher education hasn't responded to the criticism and accusations that we've heard about the value of the liberal arts and the humanities, the value of a degree, the the role that we play in affecting socioeconomic mobility. Are you suggesting that there is a campaign that needs to be organized by higher education?
Whether it is a campaign or the actions of individual colleges, I don't know. But I think the false narratives have taken hold, and somebody needs to challenge them. I mean, if you look, for instance, at take community college health professions programs, I tend to think of them as a miracle of American society because people who enter nursing or health professions programs at community colleges can enter those programs as low income students. They graduate into the middle class with a job instantly. That is like a miracle in a time that our economic stratification is worse than ever. And here we have these institutions that are lifting people up. And yet there's this meme that higher education doesn't help you. Again, whether it is a national campaign or whether it's individual, people aren't answering back. And I think that really has allowed this idea to take hold.
Okay.
I also think within higher ed on this issue, there's a lot of preaching to the choir, or I guess life in the bubble. Within the bubble of higher education, you hear about, say, I trace a lot of this back to when Obama was running for re-election, and that primary campaign on the Republican side, Rick Santorum sort of started in a lot of these issues. Don't go to college. You're disrespecting my family by saying everyone needs some college education. People in higher ed sort of laughed at it and said, oh, that's silly. But guess what? Rick Santorum won the battle of ideas on that issue. And prior to that, a lot of Republican governors were just like the Democrats, talking about we need more people to have degrees, we need more people to have certificates. Rick Santorum started, then the pundits came in, and now that consensus is gone. Higher ed has been far too silent.
I think it is very sad that a man who wore sweater vests won the narrative on this point, Scott.
You know, we have not explored the sweater vest issue there, but that's a good area for future coverage.
So, let's see. Do I have a question? Okay. Um, you didn't talk about accreditation, and I know accreditors have been feeling like they've been in a bunker mentality for a long time. So, what what lies on the horizon for accreditors?
So, accreditors have a really tough situation. Everyone complains about them, but there is no agreement on what to do about accreditation. And accreditors, and we've seen this in some cases in Florida, when accreditors act too tough, they get sued and end up in court. And then when a college goes under, people say, where was the accreditor? Lamar Alexander has talked about this a lot, and I think may put together some proposals. The problem, I think, is that no one in the public really understands accreditation, and I don't think people have agreed on what they want from accreditation. Accreditation is now essential to the process because you need accreditation for your students to be eligible for student aid. But when I talk to people who've gone through accreditation or colleges, I don't hear enough colleges say, that really made me a better institution. Many seem to view accreditation as making sure that minimum standards are met, which accreditation does, not necessarily producing greatness. But many don't want accreditors to produce greatness. They want to be left on their own. And so I think we're going to see a lot of talk. I will go out on a limb here and say I don't predict we'll see major change on accreditation because there is no consensus on what to do about it. They are an easy entity to kick around, harder to replace.
Yeah. And I guess I would agree with you and say that if accreditors weren't the gatekeepers for Title IV funding, I'm not sure how many institutions would be seeking accreditation.
Yeah.
You raised one point about how um, the profile for higher education leaders is changing and needs to change. And I was wondering, we think about the Clark Kerrs of our time, of previous generations,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't really have those kinds of pillars today in the higher ed community. And it seems like with the more politicization of
Mm-hmm.
higher ed that comes, it's less likely for people to step out and speak
Well,
up.
it's hard. It's hard. I mean, remember, Clark Kerr got fired. So
Right.
it is not easy to take stands. The interesting trend, we just did a story about how more presidents are being appointed in their 70s or late 60s. And once upon a time, the idea was if you want a presidency, you need to get it by 60, because people hoped for a long tenure as a president. What's going on, I think, isn't what our story by my colleague Rick Seltzer said. It's not that people are saying, oh, I'm looking for a 68-year-old president, but they frequently want presidents who have had a successful run as a president already. And so if you look at the new president of Harvard, he had 10 years as president of Tufts before that. If you look at the new president at Berkeley, she had 10 years at Smith College before that. So the reality is, if you rise through the ranks and have a decade-long presidency, you're not in your 40s anymore, and you're already getting up there. The thing that is problematic, and I wish long lives to those and other presidents in their 70s, is that actuarial tables will catch up with this trend. And if you have boards saying, I don't want to look at anyone who hasn't already been a president and hasn't already been a president for a long time, it's not just that they're looking at older candidates, they are more likely to be looking at male candidates, at white candidates, because the diversity in American higher education leadership is tending to come from those who are coming in, not those who already had presidencies. So I think there is a nervousness about people who haven't been tested as a president. The other thing is that the pressure on presidents is far greater. With social media, there is no such thing as a president out of the line of fire. Everyone knows what's going on. Everyone can tweet about it. It is tougher to be a president these days than it once was. But I do, while I see a lot of good people getting appointed who have experience, and that's wonderful, and people are living longer. But, the president of the United States, not commenting on him otherwise, is in his 70s, and he defeated Hillary Clinton, who was not a young up-and-comer herself. So I do see American attitudes changing, and I worry about the next generation of leadership.
Yeah. Tara, I think we had somebody who was going to ask a question. Is that correct? Great. James,
I'm glad
welcome.
you brought up. Thank you. I'm glad, Scott, that you brought up the presidential issue because, as you know, we're going through a search at present. And I am not part of the younger generation aspiring to much of anything other than a nice retirement cottage someplace in 3 or 4 years. But it seems to me as though there's been a shift over the last 25 to 30 years. I remember when Bourne went out to Oklahoma, when was that, 23, 24 years ago? We started seeing other states emulate this politician as president.
Hmm.
And it was incredibly successful in that they knew how to manipulate the legislature, they negotiate rather than manipulate,
Hmm.
and were very successful in many instances. But it seems like with the advent of performance funding, political skills may matter less and business skills may matter more. Do we see a
Hmm.
trend in this at all? As I look at some of the performance measures, I see that to me they're just 10 different ways of saying money: do more, spend
Yeah.
less. And so I'd like to know if the role of the president is shifting as the agenda is shifting.
Well, I think the role does shift. I think the presidents are increasingly outwardly focused in trying to um, influence things like how you do performance-based funding. I mean, Florida's formulas are very interesting. And so you look, we wrote a story a few years ago that focused on the impact on New College of Florida. And I believe at the time, part of the Florida formula rewarded a college for the number of employed graduates in the state. And what somebody pointed out to me was that meant if a graduate of a state university got a job dressing up as Mickey Mouse at Disney, that counted as success. If a graduate won a Fulbright fellowship to go study in Europe, that counted as a failure. And so performance funding is always, how are you measuring? Who decides? And you need informed people to do that. I am not a believer that all political presidents are good or bad. I think you have to look at what are their roots, what is their experience, and what are their values. I think to take a great Floridian, Charlie Reed, who then went on to California. I believe, not everyone loved all his policies, of course, but I think he was deeply engaged in higher education and K 12 for that matter, and brought an informed perspective. And as informed a perspective as someone might with a more traditional background. Um, I also have seen politicians appointed who didn't seem to have any evidence that they were engaged in higher ed issues, and they have not done so well. And so my questions aren't, is it a politician or not, but is it a politician who spent time thinking and working on higher ed? And is it a politician who understands how higher education works, who respects shared governance, who respects faculty roles, who understands what academic freedom is? We just saw the collapse of a presidency in Georgia, where a politician was named to a presidency of a rapidly growing state university, and all of a sudden he's gone after after a controversy over academic freedom, and in this case, whether he was taking action about some students who were protesting during the national anthem. Um, and I think an experienced academic might not, or somebody who experienced with academic values, might not have liked what the students had done, but would have said, hey, this is higher ed. People are entitled to take a stand. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And JJ, I understand you have a question to ask.
Is that the text question I just saw pop up?
Yes.
Okay, let me here. Oh, oops! It just went. Okay, here it's back. Here's the notion as head of IES. Well, his appointment very down. It might, but and I assume he's going to get through. But I think the primary challenge in data collection at the Ed Department right now is inadequate support. I think a lot of data at that the Ed Department puts out is already older than it should be to promote good public policy, and in some ways also inadequate on some of the key issues. Florida, to praise the state that many of you are from, I think does a great job of collecting data, in part because Florida is not afraid of student unit records or the equivalent of that in the way that the federal government is. And to combine limits on what you collect, lack of resources to collect, and I think you have a bad impact. Um, I have time for one more question. I told my reporters that they didn't have to finish their stories to sit until 6, but that they had all needed to be done at 6. So I have time for one more question if somebody has one.
The last question I have for you, Scott, is come the end of 2018, are we looking at the same for 2019, or are we going to have something to show for 2018 that says we've made progress on moving higher education forward? And you could define that however you want.
I think in terms of federal policy, national trends, sadly, my answer is no. I don't think people are going to look at 2018 and say, this was a great year. But I am constantly impressed with the talent and commitments of people at individual institutions. So I have great hopes that at the local level we'll see real progress. But unfortunately, I think it will largely have to come from local initiatives, and when it requires money, local money. I think people can make institutions better. And how they do that is obviously depends on what the institutions are, what their mission is, what the challenges are. But I think maybe the lack of national progress makes it more important that individual institutions do things, because higher ed is, in my opinion, so important to American society. I would hate to see it stagnate, but I wouldn't advise any of you to hold your breath for enough consensus on federal policy that you'll see anything big happen in DC this year.
Okay.
So
Scott,
I wish you all the best of luck, and look forward to watching you all get named to presidencies that will be scandal free.
hug free.
Hug free, yes. Thanks,
Scott,
everybody.
thank you very much.
Take care.
And folks, the next shindig will be on Thursday, March 15th at 5 o'clock. Again, the guest this time will be Brian Sponsler, who is the Vice President of Policy for the Education Commission of the States. So while this is certainly focused on higher education, Brian's portfolio covers pre-K through grad school. So feel free to ask questions that are extend beyond higher education, especially related to alignment between high school and college. But again, I want to thank all of you, especially want to thank Shindig and Tara again for operating everything behind the scenes. I appreciate all of you coming, and hope to see you in a couple weeks. Thank you very much.